This lecture is part of the Keystone seminar at Flagler College. This is the second part of the series on John Locke. This lecture discusses his second treatise of government, which is the assigned reading for the third week of the Keystone class. So we talked about Locke in the last lecture, mentioned his connection to some of the currents of Enlightenment thought, and also talk in some brief detail about his other works, about his epistemological work called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, wherein he proposes that people start out as a tabula rasa, as a blank slate, and also his letter concerning toleration, which advocates the separation of church and state. In the two treatises of government, Locke takes up the question of the origin of government and the purpose of government, or what he calls civil government. And the first treatise, which is not assigned for this class, is directed against the writings of a man named Robert Filmer, a theologian who died in the 1670s, I believe. Actually, no, it was earlier than that, 1653. I just glanced at my notes here. 1653, a man who had written a work called the Patriarcha, or the Natural Power of Kings. And Filmer was one of the leading proponents in the 17th century of the idea of the divine right of kings. That is, that God had ordained kings to be the rulers over mankind, and that the fundamental rights the natural rights applied to kings, and then through kings by extension to everyone else, but all of those natural rights ran through the kings, and the kings were to ensure that those natural rights were upheld, but the privileges of the kings were primary in any political system. Filmer, in other words, was an advocate of the kind of absolutism that was seen in other areas of Europe in the 17th century. And in the first treatise, Locke attacks this position. If you want to get a sense of this, chapter 1 of book 2, which was not assigned but might be worth just skimming over at least, sums up a lot of Locke's arguments against Filmer, goes over what he discussed in the first treatise, he says essentially, and to some extent this is a critique of Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan as well, who was also an advocate of absolutism. He says that those who read this will not give just occasion to think that all government in the world is the product only of force and violence. And that's what he sees absolutism becoming. This is government by force, it's government by violence, it's government by coercion. And civil government properly ordered to ensure the natural right of all people would not take place within that sort of framework. And so he is charting a different path of political power. Now, a lot of the things that Locke writes in the second treatise are became so fundamental to the American government system and really the system of liberal democracy all over the Western world that I think it's probably hard for students reading this in the 21st century to comprehend how revolutionary his ideas are, how new, how fresh these ideas are in the 17th century when he was writing this. But they are. And it's important to understand where we came from, where Locke started with this, and how he charts a very different direction. Now, it may be confusing if you look at this, and I realize that Locke's treatise is not the sort of thing that students in the 21st century probably read for pleasure. You may get into the language here and find it somewhat difficult to comprehend. And so this lecture is intended just to give you some background into some of the ideas, to give a kind of overview of what he argues here, and then to prompt you at that point to go and explore for yourself in the text and to talk about these things in the discussion board. Locke begins his discussion of government by referring to the state of nature. And this is where modern students tend to get confused. They're like, what does the state of nature, whatever that is, have to do with government? Why can't we just start talking about the structures of government, the branches of government? Why can't we talk about the legislative and the executive and the judicial, and really get into the kind of again, the structures of government? Well, Locke was a philosopher, and he started, like other political philosophers had done before him, with the theory behind all of this. Locke is much less interested in the practical application of it than to talk about what is really important conceptually and ideologically with government. And to do this, he's got to start with an exploration of human nature and of natural rights, the things that are inherent in human beings simply by virtue of their sharing in humanity, the things that all human beings should hold in common, because, as we'll see, government is designed for the purpose of upholding and protecting natural rights. The natural rights that Locke identifies are life, liberty, and property. Now, these are then, of course, taken by Thomas Jefferson and turned into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, though I think we could argue that when Jefferson talks about the pursuit of happiness, he's really talking about the pursuit of property, though he may frame it slightly differently than Locke does. They're thinking very much along the same lines, and Jefferson was influenced by Locke to a great degree, as we'll see here. So he starts with the state of nature. What is the state of nature? Well, it's the condition that mankind was in, and much of this is happening on the conceptual level rather than any sort of understanding of historical development of the human species. Though Locke is an empiricist here, and he gets much of this from observing the way that human beings work and looking at human development. He's not necessarily proposing a historical narrative to this. Okay, so mankind starts in the state of nature. Well, what is the state of nature? In chapter 2, where we start our assigned reading, he talks about some of the things that exist in the state of nature. The state of nature is a state of perfect freedom, first of all. So people can think what they want, do what they want, pursue whatever activities they want to pursue. It's also a state of equality, at least the beginning of the state of nature. In other words, the beginning of the development of mankind, and for Locke this would have been, the time of Adam and Eve. As a Christian, he would have believed in the narrative of the Bible, at least conceptually speaking, and so, at the time of Adam and Eve, they began in the state of nature, when they were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and they had a state of perfect freedom. They could do what they wanted. They had a state of equality. Everyone was equal. Everyone had equal opportunity to obtain things, to do things. There was no coercion involved of one person over another. And the law that governed this was what he calls the law of reason. The law of reason dictates, because this is part of nature, it dictates that all men, all people are equal and independent, he says, and that no one, I'm quoting here, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So they live by the law of reason. That's just inborn, or rather, this is sort of what is established by nature, what mankind learns from nature. And again, this is what's inherent in mankind himself. Now, something happens, though, while man is still in a state of nature. He recognizes that there are things that are useful for, and I'm sorry I'm not using gender-neutral language here. I keep using the word mankind instead of humankind. I'm really just going with Locke's vocabulary more than anything. This is not to try to preserve some sort of traditional patriarchal system or anything. I will try to use gender-neutral language as much as I possibly can. But in any case, when mankind figures out that certain things are useful and good, then he or she uh, attempts to attain them and succeeds in attaining them. I'm talking about things here like land, and land for growing food, right, for engaging in agriculture, animals to eat their meat and use their other byproducts, water, things to build shelter with, things to make clothing out of, right? These are the sorts of things that are useful, and the state of nature dictates that man should be pursuing these things because he wants to attain happiness, wants to attain prosperity. But this then potentially causes a problem because there is a scarcity of useful things. And this leads to a situation of inequality. Now, this inequality is mitigated or tempered somewhat by the institution of money, where man figures out that he can take something that is of that has intrinsic value, or that can be agreed upon has value. Locke refers to yellow pieces of metal. He's talking about gold here. And this can be set up as a medium for exchange. And that limits inequality to some extent, or at least limits the situation where one person has, or limits the problem of a person having a great deal more than others, because hoarding or obtaining more money does not necessarily mean that one person obtains the good and useful things. I mean, you can only do so much with money. You can't eat it. You can't build houses out of it, at least not unless you have a lot of it, I suppose. You can't, do things that create comfort and prosperity. You can buy those things, of course, with money, but money becomes the thing that is hoarded, and in which creates an inequality rather than the actual useful things. And so that's the second state of nature, the second part of the state of nature, when mankind creates these situations of inequality and attempts to temper that with money, which helps to some extent but doesn't solve all of the problems. And so because there are those problems, mankind then must, or determines that it is in his interest, to establish something that Locke calls civil society or civil government. That is, civil society refers to a situation where people enter into a social contract, borrowing here from the verbiage of Locke and later, as we'll see, Rousseau, enters into a social contract whereby he gives up some of the freedom, perhaps even some of the equality that he enjoyed in the state of nature, because reason dictates that inequality is a bad thing, and the inequality created by the state of nature must be tempered by some sort of authority to regulate and govern. Okay, so we have the state of nature, and then these two stages within the state of nature: the state of absolute equality and freedom, and the governing of reason. And then the imposition of property and inequality and money, which leads mankind to decide that civil society is a better option than remaining in the state of nature. Okay. Now we might see here an extension of some of the musings of Montaigne and Shakespeare, who talked about people living in this kind of pristine state. That is really the state of nature. And some people, in both Montaigne and Shakespeare did extremely well in the state of nature. He says the cannibals are on to something here. They seem to live by the dictates of reason. They meet their basic needs. They live in a state of happiness and equality, much more than people in Europe do, I think is what Montaigne's saying there. And in Shakespeare, of course, Prospero does really well in the state of nature. He's able to master, through the application of his labor and his genius, the natural forces of the island, which are represented by Ariel, his sprite servant. But he does face the dangers of the state of nature in Caliban, for instance, who he tries to temper, and Caliban then proceeds to try to rape his daughter. Miranda, on the other hand, also represents, I think, the state of nature. She has grown up in this pristine condition. And sorry if you're catching background noise here. I have children in the house who are making some noise, so hopefully that's not too distracting. But anyway, Caliban is contrasted with Miranda, who thrives in the state of nature and does extremely well in that condition, and kind of remains in this state of innocence. I'm actually going to get up and move to a different room here so that I can get away from some of this noise. Oh, shoot. Never mind. Somebody's in that room. Okay. State of nature to civil society. Now, we want to go back and parse out some of this a little better than we already have. Let's talk about what Locke says about property. Chapter 5 of the second treatise is maybe where you need to spend the bulk of your time reading and thinking. Because this is one of the things that we will discuss in greater detail as we go into other texts in this course, to talk about property, to talk about what that means and the implications of it, and whether property is a good standard, to begin with when we talk about the organization of society. Later on in the course, we're going to talk about the problems of inequality with the creation of a privileged class who have so much property that they can use it or consume it conspicuously. That we're going to see that in the readings that we do in Thorsten Veblen, and also the problems created by those who live who don't have much property, who are the victims of this great inequality, and who suffer from that in the case of poverty, or through for other reasons, specifically race. They are excluded from the system of property, and so when we read Ta-Nehisi Coates and Martin Luther King, we're going to see if we can continue to follow Locke through some of these problems of more recent times. But Locke is really, I think, the great formulator in the Western tradition of the concept of property. And he sees property as fundamental to the formation and purpose of government. So first of all, property is a natural right. It is something as dictated by natural law that mankind has a right to. And any system that he sets up, whether that's in the state of nature or with government, must ensure that property is protected. How does one come to control property or hold property? Well, it's not just that he lays claim to it, but that he, I'm quoting here, whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided, and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. And so, in order for something to become property, one has to apply labor to it. And in this we'll see that there is an implicit criticism. Whether Locke was thinking about this or not is open for debate, I suppose. But an implicit criticism of human societies that don't have that kind of standard. He says this is fundamental. People actually have to work in order to lay claim to something. That people who exist in a kind of harmony with nature, who don't have a conception of property, don't really have property and can't lay a proper claim to this. And Locke later on was used as justification for imperial ventures, for colonialism, because Europeans argued on the basis of Locke's thought to some extent that people in Africa or the Americas really didn't have a claim to the land they lived on because they hadn't mixed their labor with it. All right, I'd pause the recording because I was trying to lessen the background noise. So application of labor is what creates property. Now, the problem arises in the state of nature, as I said before, that this can lead to waste. As long as there is, and here's a quote, enough and as good left in common for others, people can continue to accumulate property. But if they reach a point where they're accumulating more than they can use properly, things spoil, in other words, then that, and particularly if they claim more through their labor, claim so much that other people don't have enough and as good left in common for them to claim via their labor, then that creates a situation of inequality. And Locke sees that as a problem. Now, he does say that money can, as I said earlier, mitigate this. That if money becomes the basis of wealth rather than the accumulation of land, then people can accumulate money to their heart's content, and they have, and there's not going to be as much waste. But given that people have unlimited desires, there may still be some inequality, and that's a problem. Now, we do reach a point, even in the state of nature, Locke says, where all of the land, the good and usable stuff is claimed, and at that point, people have to, there's still people left over, people who have not been able to claim that, and so they can then turn their labor into property. That is, they can they can go to work for those who have the property, and their labor becomes a kind of commodity that can be seen as property. That is what they have to offer, and they can exchange that then for wealth. And Locke says that this creates an acceptable situation. This, of course, can be used to justify things like slavery, I suppose. If you could argue on the basis of Locke's thinking, as some have done, that the situation for those who are enslaved is actually better than if they lived in the state of nature. That was certainly something that was used as a justification for the transatlantic slave trade, that conditions in Africa were so bad and so savage and so uncivilized that enslaving these people and bringing them into a civil society was actually better than leaving them in the state of nature that existed in Africa. I certainly don't buy that justification, and I think it's morally reprehensible, but we can see that Locke was quite portable in that regard. So property is this great good. Now, why do we need government then? If the state of nature, for the most part, satisfies the natural right, and Locke didn't, it should be said, and I'll repeat this later and extend it further, Locke didn't have a problem with some people constituting what he called what might be called a propertied class. In other words, he was not trying to overthrow the system of nobility and privilege that existed in Europe here. He took that as a given. He did, talk about equality, but really that meant equality of the assurance of the natural rights. That didn't mean equality of property. When he talks about equality, he means that every person that their life is safe, that their liberty, their ability to move, is assured, and that they can all use their labor to claim property. It doesn't mean that everyone should have an equal amount of property, necessarily, at least under the civil society as he lays it out. And this is why he is much more optimistic about the state of nature than, for instance, Hobbes is, who sees this just as a dog-eat-dog kind of situation where where life is short and violent and ends in some catastrophe because everybody's just scrambling to obtain as much as they possibly can, and so they need a single central power to assure that people won't live lives like that. Locke gives far more latitude for people to function within his civil society, and this is one of the reasons he's opposed to absolutism. So why government? Well, mankind has infinite desire. In fact, Locke's thinking also kind of dovetails with the thinking of Adam Smith here, and the whole basis of the discipline of economics, which holds at its foundation that people have an infinite amount of wants applied to a finite amount of goods. In other words, the concept of scarcity lays at the root of economics, right? So Locke acknowledges that mankind has an infinite desire. If he were given the opportunity to just obtain constantly for the rest of his existence, he would do so, because his desire is never satiated. But because people grab like this, they accumulate property, then this leads to an unequal distribution of things. And that in and of itself is not the problem. It's that people, when they arrive at this point of unequal distribution, tend to get angry about it, and thus they end up in what he calls a state of war. A state of conflict, and it's the conflict that's the problem here. Now, at the same time, it's difficult for mankind to critique himself because of what Locke calls self-love. He doesn't want to judge himself harshly, to say that he has an unfair proportion of property and that he's bilking his fellow man. That's not what people tend to do. They tend to rationalize and justify their behavior, rather than come down on the side of sincerity, and so this self-love keeps him from regulating his own desires and judging himself, and so mankind ends up in the state of war. Now, he still has, because this is a natural right, it's part of the state of nature, it's inherent in human beings, a rational capacity. That rational capacity is actually, that's a priori, or it's before the tabula rasa, that we have this, Locke says we have this rational capacity. We start out with a blank slate, but we do have that capacity to reason, and it's through that capacity of reason that we obtain ideas and information and ultimately come to prosper in our mortal existence. So he has a rational capacity. He understands that the law of reason, which is the law of nature, dictates that the state of war is a bad thing, and even that unequal distribution of property that leads to the state of war may be not so good. But because of self-love, he can't judge himself, and so we can't have this sort of endless democratization of judicial authority, as Locke puts it, and thus we see the need for a superior authority. Someone to govern someone, or something, I should say. Locke doesn't vest this in a single person. Of course, he's not an absolutist. In an entity that can regulate all of these things and put an end to the conflict and assure that the inequality is not such that it leads mankind into conflict. That's where we come to government. Now, again, Locke operated under the assumption that propertied people would be the ones administering the government. He did not advocate extending the right to choose representatives, the right to vote, in other words, the right to participate in government, to those who did not have property. That was simply not on Locke's radar, and we can perhaps see why it wasn't, because if everybody, including those who have no property, are given power in government, then those who don't have property probably constitute a majority of the society, and they would thus create laws that strip away people's property, that steal, effectively, and thus overcome the natural right that people have to property. And so he didn't see an equality in this fashion. Only those who had property, because property is so important, could participate in government. What's the purpose of government? Well, it's the protection of these natural rights: life, liberty, and property. And Locke, was optimistic that if the property class participated in government, they would assure those things, even for those who didn't have property. And this wasn't out of any benevolence. It was simply because reason dictated that they should not create conflict and put people back into a state of war by doing things that threatened the life or the liberty or the potential to obtain property of those who didn't have it at that point. On the other hand, government could not be arbitrary. This is why one of the main reasons why he's opposed to absolutism. Government had to be limited in its scope. It could not pronounce on everything. It had to leave mankind to do things for themselves and to exercise certain privileges. And so, for instance, the most basic way in which government is limited is it cannot take away man's right to life, or right to liberty, or right to property. And so it is limited in that fashion. It's also conditional. It's conditional on the proper behavior of those who are in government, and they can with right be removed if they don't assure those things. Thus Locke implicitly, he doesn't say this explicitly, but he implicitly sanctions, condones revolution. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, if you read the Declaration of Independence, you will see a lot of the language of Locke. Thomas Jefferson says that mankind is endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, things you cannot take away from people because it's built into human nature. That among these, he says, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that we now live in a condition, he says, where those things are being threatened. That the conditional form of government that John Locke advocated is not functioning, and our lives, our liberty, and our pursuit of happiness, our property, is being taken away from us or being compromised. Thus, we as the people whose voice must be heard, our consent must be had. The consent of the governed is important here. And so we can overthrow the king. We can declare our independence and decide that the king no longer has authority here. Okay. So that's how Locke arrives at this notion of government. It should be said again, and I said this before. Let me underscore the point that this is very much a Eurocentric perspective, and Locke is easily used to condone European oppression, enslavement, and imperial control of other peoples, because even though these people exist in the state of nature, they in the viewpoint of those who use Locke this way, do not have property. They were not applying their labor to property. They were not, treating things that ought to be treated as property in the way that made them constitute property. And so, Locke can be used for justification of things that we probably would find morally reprehensible. That doesn't mean that Locke necessarily ascribed to those things or had in mind, the oppression and enslavement of African and Native American peoples, but he could be used in that way. Okay, hopefully that gives students then some background into this so that you can read the text closely, come up with ideas, get a sense of all of this. You're going to need to write a paper that partially assesses the ideas that Locke has about property and equality, and so that's a big part of our task here. And I look forward to discussing these issues with you on the discussion board. Thank you.